In this workshop we will continue to explore the ComfortClient user interface. My name is Julian Wigman and I'm the principal developer. So let's start ComfortClient. In part 1 we looked at the main workspace, the tabbed floor plan area. We also looked at the keypad and we looked at the control pad. We looked at arming and disarming the system, and we explored some of the menu options at the top of the screen. We looked at application and we looked at information. In this workshop we're going to look at configuration. So let's go and look at the configuration menu, and we're going to start by exploring the settings tab. In the installation workshop we looked at this tab and how we set the location of our CCLX file and our user data location, where all our user related information on ComfortClient will be stored. If we want to change that at any time, the location of our CCLX or the name of it, or even where we want to store user data, then we can go into this location at any time and change those values. If we change the data file path for the user data, then it will automatically migrate our existing data from the old path to the new path. So let's log on to the system. This is my test environment, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4 to log on, and you'll see it's refreshing. As I change and trigger PIRs and errors on my floor plan, you'll see that not only does the floor plan change, but if you look at the tabs at the top of the floor plan window, you'll see the icon is changing from a house symbol to a red LED. This is showing that for tabs that are on screen, when there is activity. Here you're seeing activity on both tabs, but if I had lots of tabs and only activity was happening on some, then only those LEDs would light up. If I hover over those tabs, you will see that information is displayed to show me what the events were and what were the last events that happened. This is not a list that extends forever, it wraps and it rolls. So it will show me, in this particular case, it will show me up to 25 of the most recent activity that's happened on that particular tab. Click a different tab, the list is different. So I'm only showing things that are specific to that tab when I hover over them. How do we configure that? Well, in settings we've got activity level monitoring. So I said it only shows the first 25. We can affect that and change that and set how many we want to show. So if I want to show the first 5, I can reduce that down. When activity happens on the tabs, then the house symbol changes for a period of time. The reset time governs when it returns back to the default value, and I've set that at the moment to 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. The top half of the screen generally sets the type of icons that we want to use within our system. The bottom half of the screen defines what we want to use those icons on. So there are 2 types of tab that we can add in Floor Plan Editor, or in ComfortClient, sorry. There are 2 types of tab we can add in ComfortClient: floor plans and browser tabs. Each of those tabs can have its own default. So here you'll see we've got a house symbol for the floor plan and an Internet Explorer icon for a browser tab. If we don't like those and we want to change them, then we can press the change button and we can go and pick an icon from anywhere on our machine we want. In this case, let's set it to that garden light on, and now my activity symbol has changed to that symbol. And whenever, if I come out of OK, you'll see now that that default inactive state is changed to whatever symbol I just picked. I go in again. If I don't want that symbol and I want to go back to the defaults at any time, I can press reset and it will take me back to the default icon that I've set up. So those are the 2 defaults that happen when there is no activity. Where there is activity, I can set up to 3 different levels of icon that I can apply to my activity that's happening within the environment. By default I've called them level 1 and 2. By default I've called them level 1, 2 and 3, and those appear in the drop downs you'll see at the bottom of the screen when we come to configure the individual activities. If I don't like the name, I want to call it something like information, warning, critical. Then I can change those names, and you see as I've changed, it now changes the values in the drop downs. So against each of those levels that I pick, I can select an icon. So here you'll see I've set a rag status, red, amber, green. If I want to change that, I don't want red, amber, green, actually I want to pick somewhere else on my system, I can maybe go off and pick a different icon. Let me pick that one. And again I can press reset if I want to return back to normal. So once I've set the icons I want to appear for each of my up to 3 levels, then I can say for each of my events that are coming in from Comfort or from my plugins, what level do I want to show. So if I want to say, well, whenever a counter event comes in, I want to show it as information, but whenever a zone comes in, I want to set it to critical. You can set the values the way you want to set them. Here you can see I've actually got the red, amber, green the wrong way around, but you get the idea that you can set those to be whatever you want to be. So then whenever I trigger a PRR, in this case now, it will be a different color, so it's now green instead of red as we had it before. So activity level monitoring allows you to not only configure the hover over information that appears, but also how frequently the icon resets back to normal and what icon is in the first place. Filters and exclusions, now we covered that when we looked at part 1. This is a pattern matching filter that allows us to reduce the amount of information that we bring into the environment. So if you're looking at your monitor tab, for example, and you're seeing a lot of information coming from plugins that you don't want to see, then you can suppress that information. So I can add a new filter by pressing the add button. I can give it a name, and then I can apply what pattern I want to apply. So if I want to say flag 05, for example, whenever flag 05 comes in to our environment, I want to filter that information somehow so it's not shown, then I can put in a match. So if it was flag 05 and only when it's on, so only when it's set to 1, then I could put whatever pattern length I want in to make that work as well. If I want to use plugins, if you look in the help file, you'll see I can use information, and I can use what we call squiggly bracket placeholders to determine which parts of the plugin I want to filter. Once you've applied your pattern, you can then decide what you want to filter. So M stands for monitor, A stands for activity, this tab when we were hovering it just a second ago, E stands for event, S stands for status, so status being these 2 boxes at the bottom of the status bar. So by checking the boxes that we want to be appropriate, we can filter the information that's displayed within our interface. So we've got receive mode and we've got send mode. You'll notice activity doesn't appear in send because it's only appropriate for incoming events. So if you don't want flag 05 ever to go out to the outbound event log, you can check that box. If I don't want that setting anymore, I can press delete and it'll move it. I can use move up and up, move down when I've got lots of events and when I have lots of exclusions, just so that I can reorder them in the list. Time programs and reminder messages are 2 features that you'll be familiar with through the use of Configurator, User Mode, or other programs such as WizComfort. If I go into time programs, the first thing it does is go to the live Comfort system, and it will read back my current time programs that I have set up. You'll see that they are displayed in the left hand panel, and it's showing default names, but if you've renamed them, obviously then that may show as well. You'll also see one of them is green. The red-green identifier here, icon next to it, determines whether they're active or not. So if I highlight program 06, you'll see status on. Highlight program 05, status off. I can activate by either changing the status on the drop down here, and you see it's gone red to signify I've changed it. So when I write it back, it would then go back to black again. So that's showing things that I've changed in the tree. I can also right click the tree and turn it off from there. So I can enable or disable through different ways. You'll see it's gone back to red again to show that I've changed that setting. So for a time program, you can determine which response triggers from that time program, which days of the week, what time it triggers on, and whether it's enabled or not. So if I say this particular this response here, I want to go on Tuesday and Friday, I want to activate that at 10 o'clock at night, I can press OK. When I press OK, it will take any of the icons that I've set to red, either the ones that I've changed, and it will write those back to Comfort. So if we look at the monitor window here, you'll see it's written those 2 changes for time programs back to Comfort. So it's not writing all of them back, so it's selective in which it writes back, so it's performant. So let's look at reminders. Reminders are slightly different from time programs. Unfortunately, Comfort doesn't currently support in firmware the ability to read live reminder configuration from the Comfort system. So unlike time programs, I can't go off and bring that information back into this user interface to know where our starting point is. So instead, what I do is I go to the CCLX file. So the CCLX file, being hopefully representative of the settings that you made and uploaded, will give us a good idea about what our current settings are for reminders. Again, as with time programs, I can right click and set them to on to enable them, or I can change the value on the drop down as well, and again you'll see it's highlighted as red to show that that value has been changed. So for reminders, I can pick which mailbox I want it to be forwarded to, I can pick the days of the week I want the forwarding to happen, and again I can pick the time I want that to happen. When I press OK, you'll see it writes that any changed events back to Comfort. So I am now writing that information directly back into the Comfort system. The downside of this is because we can't read the current information from Comfort, there is a possibility that you could overwrite configuration that you'd set up outside of the CCLX file. That's a constraint at the moment that I have to try and deal with. So we touched on options when we looked at installation and part 1. If we just step through some of the icons that are available, persist configuration menus. Generally, when you first log into Comfort for the first time, the configuration menu is greyed out until you authenticate for the first time. Once you've authenticated, that configuration menu unlocks, which means you can then come into this option screen and you can then change this to enabled. So by setting that back to disabled, as soon as I log out, the configuration menu locks out. So it largely means you can't configure the system if you're not logged in. You'll see in the workspace here our tabs are at the top of the screen. I can move them left, right, top, bottom, so I can move where those tabs appear. By default, when you install ComfortClient, they're on the right hand side, so we move them as part of our installation workshop. The idle task here I'm going to come back to in a second when we look at Window Manager. You will see in the monitor window, if I look to the right here, config file auto saved in green. This is to enable us to, for disaster recovery effectively, to save settings regularly back to our Comfort configuration file, so we don't lose things in the event of any sort of crashes. The frequency at which we do that is the save interval. It's set to 300 seconds or 5 minutes at the moment. So every 5 minutes it will auto save back. If you don't want that setting, then make it very high or set it to 0. Activity that comes into ComfortClient is written out to the external log file, unless of course you've put filtering on. The duration in which those individual log files exist, because it creates a log file for each day, is governed by this setting. So I've set it to 1,000 days here, so it's a pretty long period. So generally I'm going to build a lot of log files up in that folder. If you want those log files to be truncated after a number of days, so say after 10 days you want to delete any older log files, then you can set this figure down. Set it down to 5 and you'll only keep 5 days worth of logs. If you're connecting to Comfort via an Ethernet 1 or 2 card, then you're using the TBO chipset, and this TBO check enables us to determine when we try to connect and we press the connect button whether someone has already connected. So maybe you're connected in Configurator and logged on. If you try to connect with ComfortClient, instead of giving a nasty error message, we can now give a more graceful error message to say someone is already using the system. And you can also force disconnect them as well if you want to do that. If you're not using Ethernet 1 or 2, are you using Ethernet 3, that uses a different chipset, and that value needs to be left as disabled. Auto Connect enables us, as soon as we log into the Comfort application, Auto Connect allows us, as soon as we start the Comfort application, to connect to the UCM. So instead of having to press the connect button on the connection tab, it does it for us. Date time, when we log on to Comfort, we can set the system to automatically sync Comfort with the time on our PC. That's become less of a requirement if you're using an E3, because that can automatically sync for you. But this was a method of allowing us to keep our Comfort system in sync based on the fact that generally our PC will be kept in sync with the internet. Max Drift is there to prevent unnecessarily time syncing when the time is radically different on the PC. So for example, it may be that you're not syncing with internet time and you incorrectly set the time. So instead of incorrectly setting the time on Comfort, then that prevents you from doing that. Finally, we have online updates. If you're not connected to the internet when you're running ComfortClient, it will save you time by not having to go out and look for updates, look for changes from the Comfort forum. It will help you not having to go and look for changes on the Future Home website if you're not connected to the internet. So you can disable those features. If you are connected to the internet, I would strongly advise that you leave those enabled. So you can check for new versions of ComfortClient. You can look for new changes to whitelists. So whitelists are there to prevent from rogue or unauthorized plugins from being used with ComfortClient. So it's a by invitation only event through the whitelist. And Shape Factory updates as well, which we touched on when we looked at the Shape Factory workshop. So those are some of the things you can set up as part of the options system. So let's look at floor plan. So now let's look at Window Manager. We touched on Window Manager when we looked at workshop 1, and we added a couple of floor plans, sample 1 and 2. If I want to insert another floor plan, I can either insert above where my current cursor position, or I can insert below. So let's create one called sample 3. And we can pick what type of what plan we want to add. So let's add sample 3 to be consistent. If I press OK now to come out of Window Manager, you'll see it adds sample 3. You'll also see it refresh to my floor plan. Now, I did that because I mentioned in earlier workshops that the refresh is intelligent in that it only requests items from Comfort that need to be displayed on the floor plans. So by introducing an additional floor plan, we potentially introduced more active objects that we need to refresh from Comfort. So I force a refresh automatically to make that happen. Let's go back into Window Manager again. So if I don't want a floor plan, then I could press the delete button. I can also add, as part of Window Manager, browser window. So let's add a Comfort Forums. Browser window, and let's pick type browser, and you'll see now we've got a URL. And we can go to whatever path on that we want to be. Press OK for that now. You'll see we now have a browser tab. You'll notice the different icon because that's the default icon for a browser tab. Click on that, you'll see that we go to the website, or you'll see an error message in this case because I spelt it wrong. Let's go and correct that, shall I? I can go back and let's edit that URL. and now you'll see we go to the right URL. I can go into Window Manager again. Don't want floor plan 3 anymore, so let's delete that. Let's change the order of the tabs as well. Actually, I want my Comfort Forums to be in the middle, so let's just move up, and let's move sample to the end, sample 1 to the end. So you can change the order of your tabs as well on screen as well. So if we look at the bottom of the screen here, depending on what type of item you pick on, so if I pick on a floor plan, you'll see floor plan related information. If I pick on a browser, you'll see browser related information. You'll notice this icon next to the tabs. If I right click on any of those nodes, you'll see it highlights, and you'll see I can set as home page. So what does home page mean? Well, okay, you can see it also ticks it here as well, so I can also do the same thing by just ticking the checkbox on the main form. But what is a home page? Well, let me come out of that again, and I've set the home page to sample 2, and you see it jump to sample 2. By default, when you start ComfortClient, it will always position itself on the first tab in your tabbed workspace. If I want it to jump to a different tab on start of ComfortClient, then that's what the home page is. So if I exit ComfortClient and let's start it again, instead of going to the first tab displayed, which was in this case a browser tab, it will now jump automatically to my home page. You'll also notice if we go to the application menu, I've got this item here that we didn't touch on when we looked at part 1, because it's linked very much with the way that we use windows and floor plans and how we look. You'll notice this Go Home On. If we look at the application menu, you'll see we have this Go Home On. You'll see we have this Go Home On icon. We touched on this during part 1, but we've parked this because it's more applicable to our window manager settings. If I turn Go Home On, if I'm on a different floor plan, you'll notice this green area at the top of the screen. So as I'm moving the cursor around, that 51131 stays green. If I stop the cursor or keyboard activity, after a timeout period, you'll see that goes red. And you'll also notice my tab switched back to my home floor plan. So let's, for example, so at the moment I go into Window Manager again, that's my current home page. If I set sample 1 to move my home page, change it, come out again, you'll see I now switch to sample 1 as my home. Move on to a different tab, wait for the timeout, so you'll see up the top here when I'm moving the cursor around it's still green. As soon as I stop and it goes red after a few seconds, I switch back to my home floor plan. So home floor plan is all about moving back to that either at startup. So home floor plans are all about either jumping to that page at startup or jumping back to that page after a period of inactivity. So that's home pages. There are 2 other things we can do with our tabs and how we access those tabs. Go back into Window Manager, and you'll notice down the bottom we have this concept of scan sequence. So for each of our tabs that we've added in, or we've got currently added in, we can add them to what we call a scan group. So let's say we've got 3 tabs on the screen at the moment, but we only want we want our browser window and we want our sample 1 to be part of our scan group. So if we enable that for the Comfort Forum browser tab and we go to sample 1, you'll see so let's go back into Window Manager again and explore some of the other features at the bottom of the screen here. So you'll see this section called Scan. This enables us to determine a round-robin sequence of a way of demonstrating the different tabs and monitoring the different tabs in the interface. So let's say we want to set up a scan sequence that encompasses all or some of those tabs on the screen. So let's say we're going to pick Comfort Forum, so let's set that to enabled, and let's set sample 1 to enabled. Okay, and we can set for each of these tabs how long we want them to hold on those tabs. So let's say Comfort Forums, they're all set to 5 by default, but let's say we want to set that one to 10. So it's going to hold on Comfort Forums for 10 seconds, and then it's going to hold on that tab for 5 seconds before moving back to where the next one in sequence effectively. We can change the sequence order by changing this value on the bottom of the screen here. Okay, so we can set a polling period by which it will cycle through the tabs. Now by default it doesn't do that by default, so we need to enable it. Okay, so we enable it through our options. So let's go back to options. Now by default at the moment what we've got our idle task set to is home. If we set that to scan instead, now we've enabled the scan feature, but it's not enabled until we actually turn it on. So in fact it is on at the moment. So if we wait the 10 seconds, we should see our tabs change, and you see that one's now switched to Comfort Forums. Wait our number of seconds and you should then move to a different tab. So it's going to continually cycling around those in a loop. So great for demonstration. It's great for just being able to have it in the background. So you'll see similar things on camera type systems where it enables you to cycle around the tabs on the screen on an event. So we can turn that off at any time by turning the scan off, and that will turn off that feature, or we can turn it on again via the application menu. So scan on, scan off. The final thing we can do with our tabs, if we go back to Floor Plan Manager, is we have this feature called Jump. Now Jump allows us to automatically, as the name suggests, jump to a tab when a certain event happens within our system. And the way we control that event is to use a filter, and a filter is a condition. So we haven't, you can see at the moment we've dropped down that list, we haven't any conditions defined. Conditions are defined in our condition manager. So if I go into condition manager, you see at the moment I've got no conditions defined. If I add a new one, I can give it a name, I can put a description in here, and then I can start to build my condition at the bottom of the screen. What do I want to happen before that condition evaluates to true? So let me add a new row to my condition, and let's say I want to, when comfort counter value 2 is greater than 5. So I can say when that happens, when counter 2 is greater than 5, I want this condition to evaluate to true. Now by default conditions are off when you create them. If I want to enable them, I can again enable them from here, or I can enable them from here, consistent with what you've seen in some of the other applications. So that condition is now enabled. If I go back to Window Manager, I can now pick that condition. So I can say whenever condition test123 evaluates to true, I want to jump to the particular tab that I put that jump condition onto. So if I save OK to that now by default I've turned scan off, so it's not doing any scanning, so I'm sat on sample 1. If I log on to my system, and you remember I said I want to set to counter 2 being greater than 5, so let me set counter 02, let's set it to 7. So what should happen now when we press OK is it jumps to the browser tab, as you can see it did. If I was to move back to a different tab again, and this time put a different counter value in, so it's less than 5, it still jumps. Why the hell does it still jump? That's an interesting bug. Cut this out. Okay, so you saw how jump enables you to jump to a tab when a certain criteria is met. Go back to the condition manager. We entered a very simple condition there, which is a single line. We can add more lines as well, and all those values together to create the condition that we want to happen. So if I want to say if counter 2 is greater than 5, or sensor 4 is less than 5 or less than 9, then we could do that as well. So counter greater than 5 or sensor less than 9. Or I can make that an AND, so both of those have to evaluate to true individually before the total result is true. Now with calculations, so with conditions normally evaluate left to right. So it's going to do them in order that you're seeing on the screen. So you can move the order up and down if you want to change the order in which those conditions combine together to create the overall result. Now if you want to have a bit more control over those, and if you know about condition logic, you know that you can put brackets around areas of your condition chain to actually make them work in a better way. So if I had, for example, 3 items on screen, so let's just say comfort flag 3 equals true. So if we have those 3 condition items and we want to say, well, actually we want to AND the first 2 but OR it with the third one. So if we want to say take the first and second rows and those together, but then all that with the third row, what we would do is we can put brackets around various parts that we want to collect together. So if you see down the bottom here, was in the sequence you're saying 1 and 2 and you now have brackets around them. But if I want to say now or 3, so that's going to say if counter 2 is greater than 5 and sensor 4 is less than 9, or flag 3 equals true, it's going to evaluate the whole condition to true. So you can use brackets to create some very complex structures that, if you're used to condition logic and how you build conditions, you can build some very advanced conditions that evaluate based on the bracket logic, not the left to right ordering sequence of the conditions and how you've ordered them. So we'll come on to conditions more when we look at floor plans as well. Conditions really span 2 areas in ComfortClient. The area we're setting up here in ComfortClient is what we call system conditions. The conditions that we set up on individual floor plans are what we call floor plan conditions, and they have slightly different effects, but the setup and the configuration is exactly the same. If we don't want conditions anymore, we can use the delete button. We can sort the order of them so that we get them all sorted nice and alphabetically. So if you've got a lot of conditions in your system, you can see the wood for the trees and you can find them easily. So there's 2 places in ComfortClient where we use conditions at the moment, system conditions at the moment. One is in Window Manager when we look at jump filters, as we showed. The other is in system settings, system sound settings. So the other is in sound settings. So if we go into Sound Manager manages sound settings. So here we can see for all the comfort inbound responses that we can get, we have the ability to enable or disable sounds for those system sounds coming in. And you'll see by default I've enabled and disabled some. Now for each of those sounds we have a phrase string. That phrase string in general mirrors the phrase string that you get from Comfort as well. So if you're on a keypad, a real keypad in Comfort, then that phrase that is returned is generally the same phrase that I'm showing here by default. But if you want to, you can change that. So I can go to the ellipsis here for this individual phrase, and instead of comfort state idle, I could pick something else if I wanted to. So if I wanted to say instead of comfort state idle, it's comfort state idle number 10, and I want to test that, then you see that I can change it. I can go in and say actually I don't want comfort, I want to call it. So you can pick the individual elements that comprise the phrase string and build up the phrase string that you want to show. You'll also see, by the way, here it shows that a value is available in drop downs. Now if we look back at some of our phrase strings, you'll see that some have this squiggly bracket value symbol. Now that replicates what you have within the individual responses coming back from Comfort. So some responses report a value or a user or some sort of information like that, which is dynamic. It's not fixed information. So enabled to be able to show that information, we need to include a dynamic value, and that's what value is. So wherever you see one that has value, when you look at that and change the settings for that one, then you'll see that that box is now ticked, and you'll see now when we drop down a list, that squiggly bracket value is also available to pick. If the value is not available on the phrase string, then that won't appear in the drop down list, as you saw with the first example we showed. So if I don't want that value in there, I can blank it out. Or I can add it back in. So where it says value there, well, at runtime that will actually be replaced by the number of the zone. I mentioned there are a couple of places where we use conditions, system conditions. This is the other place. So we can say, well, we can apply a filter to this sound so that only operates if that filter evaluates to true. So a good example of that is we might want sound to appear during the day, but when the nighttime flag in Comfort is set, we don't want that sound to fire. Great example of when you would use filters on sounds. Again, we can test any of these sounds. And those sounds are using the sound file that we loaded in this case it's Mimer. So we looked at settings, we looked at window manager, we've looked at system sound manager, we've looked at configuration manager, we looked at condition manager. We're going to talk about floor plan editor in a later workshop, and that has a workshop purely dedicated to features of floor plan editor. We did touch on editing a floor plan in phase 1. We did touch on editing a floor plan in floor plan editor in part 1. The final thing I want to look at is connection manager. The final thing I want to look at is connection manager. Connections are effectively plugins, but they are plugins that are written by myself. Connections are plugins, and they are written by myself, the author. They enable us to interact with external applications in an extensible way through our floor plans. So there are two parts to setting up Connection Manager. First is to compile a list of connections and the things that we can connect to, and the second is how we then use those connections on our floor plans. So part A, the setting up the services, as we call them, that we're going to use. So setting up connections is a two-phase. So setting up connections involves two phases. One, setting up the services themselves, the things that we can connect to. The second is setting up how we use those services, and we use the second part, we configure that through Floor Plan Editor. So let's look at a simple example of connections, and we're going to come back to connections in more detail in a later workshop. So for the purposes of this demonstration, what I will do is set up the email connector. Now these three connectors you see defined by default, the application one, the email one, and the GSM4 one, are installed as part of the main ComfortClient installation. Application allows me to trigger an external application or a URL from an event that happens within ComfortClient. Email allows me to send an email alert. GSM4, if I've got a GSM UCM4 card, then that also will enable me to connect and send custom messages from my GSM4 card. So let's look at email. Let's set up a new email service. So I'm going to call this my local email server. Now if you had an Exchange server, you would point this at your external Exchange environment. In this particular, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to just show the internal system. So I'm going to set up email for the purposes of this workshop. So let's pick the email node and let's pick new service. Give my service a new name, whether I want it enabled. I can give it a description as well for hover text. Where is my email server? Well, it's actually running on this machine, so I'm going to put in the name of this machine. Now if you're connecting to external email systems, often they require encrypted traffic, SSL, secure socket layer, so you can enable that secure socket layer service, and then you can pick the different types of SSL traffic that you need to send. So depending on your internet carrier provider, then you will need to pick either one of these different settings. So if you're like me on Virgin Media uses port 4685. So if you're like me using Virgin Media, we use port 465. If you're using more advanced SSL, then you'll probably use what we call implicit SSL, which is 587. So if you're using some of the newer carriers, they use what we call TLS, which is a newer secure socket transport. So once we've set up, whether we need SSL or not, I don't in this particular case. And we're going to be communicating on port 25. We then pick the user credentials to log on. So on my email system here, I'm going to log on as my username. And I've got a password. I'm also going to configure the send address. So this is where should my email come from. So if I'm going to send to me as a user here in this particular example, where do I want this to come from? So in my email system I've also set up, might be the same user, might be different, so I'm going to send it from a user called ComfortClient. Okay, I have a test button because I want to be able to test the credentials, make sure they work okay. So if I go and open my Outlook or whatever email account client you're using, you'll see at the moment I've got no messages in my inbox. If I press send to test the settings, where do I want to send to? Well, I'm going to send to this email address. Now I could send to any email address. Obviously if your email system supports forwarding, then this could be any external email address. This is a purely internal email server as part of my testing. Do I want HTML on as well? So I can determine whether I want to send an HTML, the email as HTML or just plain text. So I'll leave that ticked for the moment. And you'll see it says mail successfully sent. So it sent it to the outbound mail server. If I refresh, hopefully, and there's our test message. So we're changing the font, we're changing a few things just to show it's in HTML. Okay, so we can set up our, in this particular case, email connector service as part of the ComfortClient. So this service definition is common to all floor plans that we have running within our ComfortClient environment. So that's part A of setting up a, let me just save that as well, so obviously it prompts you to save before you exit. So part A of setting up connections is setting up your services that are available. So if you had applications, if you want to launch an application when an event comes in, then you could go here and you could say, right, I want to create a new service, let's call that Notepad. So whenever an event comes in, I want to fire up Notepad based on some information that we can provide to it. and what file do I want to call that notepad file when I press save from notepad. So I won't fill any of these. If you're in an Active Directory domain, then you might need more in-depth credentials. Where do I want that file created? Well, c:/temps/ let's create it in c:. Okay, and whether you want it to actually appear or not, or you can actually mask. So these are general settings that you can play around with depending on the application you want to fire. So in this particular case with Notepad, we actually want it to appear in the window, but you might want to be able to fire off like an exe file or a batch file or some file that doesn't display on screen, so it becomes silent. Test it. It takes some parameters, so I can pass some parameters to it. Normally these would be passed as part of the event coming in from the floor plan, and it can't find the file specified because I didn't put the full path in. So you'd have to put in the path to wherever Notepad is. Okay, so I suppose we should go and find Notepad. So that's in Windows. Just need to find Notepad, don't we? There we go. C:/Windows. So if we go to C:/Windows / Notepad. So you can see the test button enables us to actually debug before we start. Notepad.exe. That's even better. So you can use this to test the system. Probably what we should do before we go too far is actually to try it in a browser first. So that definitely works, doesn't it? C:/Windows / Notepad is enabled. Leave that blank. Okay, the second part of setting up ComfortClient. So the second part of setting up a connector is the floor plan related side to it. So let's go into our example here and let's go into floor plan editor. So let's say we want to send an email whenever this light bulb changes on screen. So let's first open that up in our object properties, and you'll see we have this events tab appear on screen, and you'll see the same connectors that we showed when we were in ComfortClient are also showed. So whatever connectors that have been installed in the system will display in this tree, and I can see from this tree what I've already configured, and I'm not limited to one event per object. So if I want to send an email and I want to send an SMS and I also want to trigger an external application, or I want to send 2 emails to 2 completely different email servers, you can do this within the event system. So if I want to add a new event to my object here, so it's counter 01, you can see I can go prick the edit button, I can click the email node, and I can say new event. So I want to say I want to create a new light on event, and I want to email myself whenever that event happens. So I can go into and pick my service that I set up. Also, incidentally, if you forgot to set your services up centrally in ComfortClient, you can actually press this icon here to start Connection Manager for services within the events environment. So again, I'm trying to help you here build your events and your connections as quick as possible. Again, I can turn it on and enabled. I can apply a filter to it, so I only want this event to fire under certain conditions, then I can use a floor plan condition to affect whether that works or not. I can press that icon here. Again, I can go off to my conditions and any floor plan conditions I've got set up. So I can set at this time a floor plan condition up. Straight again from within the event setup. And now I could pick that from the list as well. I won't apply a filter for a second. Okay, so safeguards, you'll see safeguards are on by default. Safeguards are there to, if you can imagine, for an incorrectly configured event, you could create lots of spam going out through email in this case. So if that event triggered 50 times in a second, then you could end up sending 50 emails, which would probably not be the intended functionality of your system. So we can apply, by default, safeguards are turned on. Safeguards mean that you can put a constraint on how many things will happen, even if the events do fire very quickly. So you can say minimum repeat frequency, so only send the event if it hasn't occurred in the last X seconds. So if I set that to 5 seconds, for example, that would say that if I had an event triggering every second, it would mean I only got an email every 5 seconds. So every 5th one would send me an email. If I leave that set to 0, then that's disabled. If I set my maximum down to 0, you'll see it disables the safeguards. Do not recommend that in any way, but it is possible. So if I say a maximum of 1 event in X seconds, so again, if I set that to 10 seconds, that says basically it will only send that email for 1 in every 10 within a 10-second period. And you can combine these two to create different effects. So if I set the maximum to be 1, the number of seconds to be 4, that means that it will trigger on a maximum of 1 event in every 4 seconds. I can combine them together as well if I want to, so I could say, well, I could trigger a maximum 1 event in every 4 seconds, so I can also set the maximum number of reoccurrences of that event within a certain number of seconds as well by setting these boxes. So if I want to say this event can fire a maximum of 1 times in the next 17 seconds, it'll only send it out once, and then once it's sent it out, it won't send it out until that 17 seconds has expired and you're into the second 17 seconds. So that will give you like a window in which it'll only ever do it once for the first event coming in within that window. Okay, so we can use these to restrict that sort of saturation of events that otherwise might trigger external actions in your system. So we can say where we want this to go. So hopefully I've still got this in the buffer. So I can say, no, haven't. So I can say I want to send to myself. And I want to call it test light on. And then I can, in my information here, I can create all sorts of information. I can make it rich text, change this font size, I can insert pictures, I can insert placeholders as well if I want to as well. So you see this placeholder icon here, so I can say, well, if I want to, as part of this outbound email, I want to send, for example, the value of where's value? I want to send the value of that particular object in my floor plan. Then you'll see that that value will be resolved at runtime to be sent out as part of my email. Change that text down a bit. Change its color. Various things that you can do as part of making this brand to the way you want it to be. So you can set up rich format emails. You can put pictures in. So if you want to insert a picture or one or more pictures, you can do that sort of stuff as well. So anything you can do within the HTML world. So there's our email. So we can test again. So we can press test settings. It's going to ask me where I want it to go to. Let's go on to that address. If I go back into my mailbox, send and receive, and there's my test light on. You see the value has been resolved from the placeholder, so I can now see that's the value of whatever that value was on my floor plan. So you could, from a best practice perspective, you could create an icon on your floor plan that only exists to ever send emails out. So it's not active, it's not visible even on the floor plan, but it's linked to connectors that send emails out. And by virtue of the fact that you can use placeholders to reference values on other objects, you can have one central object that manages all your emails rather than have to set them up under individual objects. Okay, so we've now configured our floor plan event. We've tested it. We've noticed it comes through an email. Let me save that. Okay, so that event's going to happen whenever whatever state we've set for that object going to happen. So in this case, this object is a single state object. So whenever on happens, that event is going to trigger. So counter 01 when it becomes on. So what on means for a counter is basically if it's 0, it's off. If it's any other value, it's on. So depending on what type of event you pick here will depend on how these states fire. And that's a discussion outside of this workshop. But just to give you a flavour for how connectors are working, then I will demonstrate this for the moment. Okay, so we've now set up our event. We've linked it to a counter 1 state of on, which is counter 1 value being greater than 0. Okay. Now we exit and save. You'll notice now our floor plan refreshes because we've changed some of the values. You'll also notice it also shows me that an email has been sent out. And the reason the email has been sent out, and you'll see it's now come up on screen, the reason it's been sent out is because one of the values that we've got referenced on our floor plan, which is counter 01, has a value. And counter 01, if we went into object matrix and we looked at counter 1, it's got a value of 12 in our comfort system at the moment. So by virtue of that counter having a value, we have basically sent an email. So we didn't even have to do anything in that case. But if that counter value changes and that counter value is still greater than 0, then it will send another email subject to the settings that you've set up as part of your safeguards. So I would expect it to send another email now because we've gone beyond the period that we defined for our safeguard. So we're refreshing a lot of counters here. Now the reason you're seeing a full refresh, by the way, on the screen here is because of the firmware version running on the test system. Later firmwares can do counter refreshes and things like that in a very much more efficient way. And we saw that when we did workshop 1. But here I'm just demonstrating another way here. So if we go back to our email, you see now we've got our test light on email and whatever value was passed on it. So events and services are the two constituent parts that we build together to create features and outbound events going through email, through applications, those sort of things. So events that we configure on our floor plan, services that we set up to underpin those events, having multi floor plan, you can combine events to different services. So I can send events to email applications. I can write to databases if I've installed the database connectors. So if I want to have a logging system that logs, so if I want to have a logging system that logs my floor plan activity out to a SQL database, for example, that you can then onwardly report on in another system, then those connectors are a very powerful way of being able to extend the functionality of what floor plan editor is about. Extend the functionality of ComfortClient. Okay. So that covers what I want to cover in this final workshop. We will look at some other features of the ComfortClient interface in a later workshop, plugins, floor plan editor in more detail. So we'll look at some more features of ComfortClient in a later workshop. So we'll look at plugins. One area we haven't looked at today with ComfortClient